Victoria told me there is a really broad variety of you coming from different countries and different expertise and level of studies. Or even we have early career professionals. So I'm really, really happy that I could be here today with you. Before I start, let me just open my presentation for you so we can have some bullet points and guideline to keep up also the time. I'll have it more or less 30 minutes presentation, and then we can have it from there and have a discussion and talk about whatever questions you might have. I'll be happy if I know to answer. Just give me a second. I'll try to open it and share it with you. All right, can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, right. So thank you again for being here today. And today I would like to talk about the geopolitics and security in the Arctic. My name is Barbara Halashkova, and I'm assistant professor at Maastricht University at the Department of International Relations and European Studies. And in my career, maybe I'll talk about my background a little bit later. Let's look at the outline. I see I put this first. So I'll briefly share a little bit of my background with you, and then we will look at the Arctic definitions and what is geopolitics. I believe that you've heard already about different Arctic definitions, right? That we don't have just one Arctic. There are many different versions of definitions and perceptions how we can define the Arctic. So we will have a look at it at first, then we will look at briefly some historical developments, then theoretical approaches versus what I call reality check. So what the theories of international relations actually offer us and what the reality is. Then we will have a look at the regional governance structures and what is the status of military cooperation in the Arctic. At the end, I would love to introduce you some of the, I would say, very updated and the newest research outcomes, part of my work that I did together with my colleagues from Canada and Finland, and that's the security in Arctic states policies and strategies. When we look at different narratives and trends that we can observe in Arctic states, policies and strategies, and not only Arctic states, we also look at the observers and indigenous peoples, the permanent participants in the Arctic Council. But since we don't have that much time, I will focus mainly on the Arctic states, policies and strategies, and what is the place of security, how they perceive and how they talk about security in their documents. And I would close up with the implications for European security, since some of you are also from Europe. This might be helpful for you to see this broader European/transatlantic security consequences of or implications of what is happening in the Arctic, how this is influencing the broader security and vice versa, what's happening in the world outside the Arctic, how this is influencing the Arctic. So coming back to my background, as I said, I'm assistant professor at Maastricht University. I currently also lead project, which is called Arctos MU. It already started last year and still lasts almost 2 more years. And the project and also the center that is one of the outcomes of the project. The center, it's an interdisciplinary research and center for the Arctic studies and human to nature interactions in the Arctic. So the center is supposed to actually serve as a hub for research, for interdisciplinary research in the polar areas or mainly in the Arctic. Recently, I've also advised to the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you might heard that actually the Czech Republic is this year for the first time aspiring for the observer in the Arctic Council. So fingers crossed for this May during the ministerial meeting. Hopefully, we will get a chance to gain the observer status in the Arctic Council. I'm also Czech delegate to the International Arctic Science Committee, the IASC. And I also worked previously in different research centers in London, Vienna, and Bratislava. My key specialization is Arctic geopolitics, foreign and security policy, and also NATO-Russia relations. So perhaps something that you haven't heard of yet during this Arctic Winter College. To my knowledge, you've covered different topics, a wide range of topics, but you haven't really focused on the IR or Arctic geopolitics and security. So I'm really happy that I can bring this to you today. And here is the promised map or map with the definitions. And as you can see on the screen, there are different lines, right? We have the blue dotted circle, which is the Arctic Circle. We have also the red line, which is not really clearly aligned with the Arctic Circle. And that's the 10 degrees isotherm, which is another definition or one of the definitions how we can define the Arctic. But for our purposes and how I understand the Arctic, together with my colleagues in IR and political science, we would, when I talk about the Arctic, I assume the definition of the Arctic as the political definition, which is that the Arctic is composed of the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by 8 Arctic sovereign states or part of their territories. And as I said, we haven't got really one universally accepted definition of the Arctic. One of those definitions that came back from ancient Greece, from the name Arctos, which specifically exactly meant region under the bear. The Arctic Circle was defined by the motion of the Great Bear in the night sky. Later on, there was assumed the definition of the Arctic Circle, that the Arctic Circle is the defining line of what is above the Arctic Circle that's considered the Arctic. Also, the definition includes that the 6632 latitude north of which the sun remains above the horizon for at least one full day in the summer and below horizon at least for one full day in the winter. Also already mentioned the isotherm definition. Then we have tundra biome or human-centered definition, because we know that the Arctic is very diverse. We have different languages, different cultures, peoples, mixture of indigenous peoples and locals. That's something that, of course, needs an attention to be paid to. But as I said, today we will understand the Arctic, and I will talk about the Arctic from the perspective of political definition. So the national boundaries of 8 Arctic states: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the US. And coming back to what I promised you, that we will talk about the geopolitics and how this applies to the Arctic. So what is geopolitics? In very narrowed and simplified way, geopolitics basically transforms the geography and geographical map, as you can see right now, onto the political map. So defining each of the different geographical locations of specific states. This gives us a possibility to define, or it predominates the position of the country, whether it's a coastal state or it's a landlocked country, what will be their foreign policy, and what will be, and how actually the geography will influence their foreign policy and domestic policy. So this is something for a start, some thoughts for the start, how actually geopolitics is strongly influencing each of the respective states' position in global politics, and especially if you look at the Arctic on the regional politics. So a bit broader definition, we can look at the geopolitics as an analysis of geographical influence on power relationships in international relations. Also, politically effects of geography, particularly climate, topography, arable land, and access to the sea. These are really crucial elements of what countries' foreign policy or policies in general. Geopolitics also tends to change as historical periods and structures of world order change. So obviously during different time in the history, we had different geopolitical situation when the borders were also changing. We had then different position of specific states back then. So during the different periods, we had different geopolitics and different security architecture as well. And looking specifically on the Arctic geopolitics, we know that geographical changes affect first political constellations and hierarchy, also second interactions of the state with other states and non-state actors, and the third, countries' access to trade and the world seas. So especially in the Arctic, these are three key elements or factors that we need to consider when talking about the Arctic geopolitics. And it also helps us to understand the dynamics and developments of the Arctic. It provides answers to the questions, why do states cooperate if there is prevailing conflict? Through the legal instruments, for example, mitigation of conflicts, or through the diplomatic efforts like prevention of conflicts. You know, why the Arctic? There is always this question: why the Arctic is so special? What's the difference? As you can see in the Arctic, old foes becoming new friends or renewed friends, if you wish. And we've witnessed it in the past, how the United States tried to get Russia on board, meaning really trying to improve the relationship with Russia, especially during the Obama administration. There was this idea behind getting really better relationship with Russian leadership. However, again, with the new administration and the Trump presidency, this was something that again went down the road and wasn't really improving that much, as you've might heard of. For example, the 2019, it was the ministerial Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi when State Secretary Pompeo declined to sign for the first time in the history of the Arctic Council the ministerial declaration. So these are the things that, of course, influence the political setup and the geopolitics in the Arctic. And of course, there are many other aspects or factors that we might consider. These are just few of them. Briefly, what we've had looking at the history of the Arctic and the developments in the Arctic, we can talk about the period of pre-Cold War, the Second World War, which was the period before 1939, that the Arctic wasn't really in the center of the attention. However, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the Arctic became a strategic location for transport of weapons and supplies, also very crucial weather stations and pockets of fighting as the Germans attempted to sabotage the Allies' operations. And especially thanks to those weather stations, many aerial operations were successful because they had the chance and the opportunity to see what will be the weather. So they simply decide either to go on with the operation or simply skip it. During that time, there was also a broad range of bases and airstrips built, also radio links that basically transformed the communications across the region. Arctic communities would never again be isolated since this moment. And as the Cold War took hold in the 1950s, the Arctic became a crucial theater in the standoff between the superpowers, between the United States and Soviet Union. So during the Cold War, this or it is referred to be the most heated point or moment in the history of the Arctic. There's been also several radar stations built across the region. with the enclaves of military personnel and a permanent fixture in many locations. Also, for the first time, we've actually had the aerial surveys developed. That was the most accurate maps yet ever created, fueling tussles over the sovereignty. And then there was this period, and I put it on the timeline, 1996. Anyone would like to guess why I put the 1996 here? What might happen in 1996?
Arctic Council.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly. In 1996, I put it here because it's really special moment in the Arctic history, that for the first time the Arctic states started to cooperate on really comprehensive basis, and the official cooperation started to broad also the areas of cooperation, starting with the pollution actually from the military installments, the nuclear waste throughout the Soviet Union back then from the Cold War, and thanks to the Finland and Norway knowledge and also resources, Russians were able to get rid of the nuclear waste. So this was the first initiative when or incentive why they started to cooperate. And then of course the cooperation broadened and grown to the pollution, talking about the pollution of the air and pollution of the rivers, with the POPs, the persistent pollutants that travel to the Arctic from different regions and causes the warming even more of the Arctic, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, economic and social questions that are part of the agenda of the Arctic Council. But one thing is left out, and that's the military cooperation or military or security cooperation that simply was intentionally left aside and is not part of the agenda of the Arctic Council. And of course, there's different discussions whether this is not one of the reasons why the Arctic actually is the region of peace and security that it's Arctic often referred to. What we've witnessed later on, more or less in the last decade, there's a new increase of militarization of the region, and we see somehow the natural developments versus a security dilemma curve that appears in the Arctic as well. And I've put on this timeline 2014, which I believe many of you know was the annexation of Crimea and the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation, and also the military developments in the east parts of Ukraine. So these are those developments that recently also, if we like it or not, spilled over to the Arctic as well. And of course, some areas of cooperation still are in place. Russia and other Arctic states, however, for example, the military cooperation or defense ministers cooperation that was in place has been stopped and hasn't been renewed yet. So it definitely had some spillover effect on the security and cooperation in the Arctic. I have those two basic IR theories that I assume you already know, the realism and liberalism, two completely opposite approaches how we can look at different regions or areas in international relations. And obviously the Arctic is considered to be the region of cooperation, and it's really strongly focusing on support of international organizations, international law, indigenous people's rights, and support of scientists. This is crucial that the Arctic states and all actors actually rely on the international law. So this is something that is very specific for the Arctic. Of course, we can find it in other parts of the world as well. But if you would ask me, how we can how we can define the Arctic from the IR perspective, from the theoretical perspective. That would be definitely liberalism as the key theory that we can approach, and then we can understand it. And here comes the theoretical approach versus reality check. Of course, in the Arctic, we, as in any other region, we have geopolitical and legal challenges, and of course, some disputes in the Arctic are rather controversial. So some parts of the theories once claimed by Vikings, later on by numerous explorers. Also, it wasn't really certain whether areas covered by thick ice constitute land or sea. So it was hard to define which parts of the Arctic are actually still land, or whether we are already talking about the areas in the sea that are considered under the common area or World Heritage. There are also challenges regarding the governance of the Arctic. So who is supposed to govern the Arctic? And we know that it's still the 8 Arctic states, despite the fact that we have the Arctic Council. It's the 8 Arctic states that have the biggest say on what is happening in the Arctic. Also, some questions regarding the definition of the borders and also maritime access rights, for example, trade, fisheries, marine disasters, naval projections. So these are all different challenges that are associated with the so-called reality check. So despite the fact that we have really good cooperation and cooperative patterns in the Arctic, there are still some challenges, geopolitical and legal challenges that might question such a good cooperative relations. And I'll be happy, of course, to come back to it during our discussion. And I put here, this is the map that illustrates how different states claim the continental shelf. It was also all around the media, all around the world, the headlines filled with, the new rush for the Arctic and those different similar headlines. But we know that this is nothing new, and each of the states which ratified the UNCLOS, the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, has the right to actually claim the prolongation of their coastline. So from the 200 nautical miles to 370 or 350. So a bit prolongation of their coastline in order to gain more resources or potentially new areas of resources. So just briefly about this still confrontation topics or areas that we can find in the Arctic. We still have some border disputes in the Beaufort Sea between the US and Canada, in the Bering Sea between the US and Russia, and also this teeny tiny Hans Island between Greenland and Canada. And in the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia, this was already solved in 2010 after 40 years of disputes. Nevertheless, none of these border disputes are really something that would rush the countries into the conflict or confrontation or open military conflict. Quite contrary, this is rather something that has to do with really complicated way how to define the borders on the sea. Of course, define the territory borders on land is much easier than on the sea. So this is rather connected to that. And of course, then the continental shelf claims that I've already mentioned. Before we move on to the concluding part, where I want to illustrate you the Arctic states' security approaches and how they look at the security, I just wanted you to look at this mind map, or how to call it, the figure that nicely illustrates all the different regional governance structures that we have in the Arctic. So remember, I said that the most important actors still are the Arctic states, but we have other platforms or organizations that might help to improve the cooperation, or in some specific areas like the economic areas, or any other areas you might think of. So just looking at the map, you can see how really interconnected it is, that some of the Arctic states are part of one platform or one organization or governance structure, while the other is left out, and how they are all interconnected. And as I said, the key organization or the intergovernmental forum is the Arctic Council, that promotes cooperation, and of course discusses different issues regarding the sustainable development, environmental protection, and any other similar issues. However, still the biggest power is in the hands of the Arctic states itself. Here's just a list of some of the military cooperation in the Arctic. You will also have the presentation available later on, so you can also check it by yourself. But just for you to know that it's not only about the so-called soft issues, the economic and social issues, but when it comes to the military cooperation, there are different platforms where the Arctic states also cooperate. And it's starting with the defense ministers of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, the NordEFCO cooperation, also the Nordic Defense Ministers meetings, Arctic Coast Guard Forum, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is a joint venture of the United States and Canada, the NATO-Russia Council, which was it still exists. It met periodically, but nowadays the cooperation is very, very limited. Also the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff, or the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. And now it brings me to the figure that I promised to you when it comes to the Arctic states. Here you can actually see each of the Arctic states chairmanship programs in the Arctic Council. So starting with the United States in 1998 till 2000, the first chairmanship program developed, until basically the last chairmanship program of Iceland 2019 till 2021. And looking at more or less in the middle on this figure, you can see there is security. And if you look at the bottom, there is the intensity graphs explanation, or legend explaining how much each of the respective states put an emphasis on in those different areas that we look at, including human dimension, international cooperation, environmental protection, pollution, economy, tourism, and so on and so forth. And one of them is security. And as you can see, it's very lightish blue, almost in majority of those in those years. And focus of the Arctic states and inclusion of security was very limited. So it's ranging from 0 to 1 to 5% in the focus of the Arctic states chairmanship programs. So, for example, if you look at the only red color, it's a few lines above in international cooperation for Finland in 2000. In their chairmanship program, they really put almost 40% of the whole chairmanship program focused on the international cooperation and stressed the importance of it. But coming back to security, again, throughout the years, you can see the trend that the Arctic states do not really stress security. They simply either avoid it or mention it very, very briefly. And here's a different table or different figures looking at the Arctic states policies and strategies, and looking at those different 12 dimensions that we look at it during our research, as I've mentioned in the beginning, with my colleagues from Finland and Canada. And I will have a link on this analysis. It's actually 300 pages long, or more than 300 pages, so you can check it later. It's open and it's accessible, so you will have a link at the end of the presentation, so you can check it out by yourself. But I just wanted to put your attention here on those, comparing security, which is more or less in the middle here, or right apart, compared to those other areas. So still, both in chairmanship programs and also in Arctic states policies and strategies, security is very limited. And you can see, surprisingly, actually, Iceland, followed by Canada, is focusing or mentioning security the most, around 12% compared to other countries. And surprisingly, Iceland, because Iceland doesn't have an army, yet they are a member of NATO. However, they don't have an army, and each of the NATO member states are securing or monitoring the Icelandic airspace on a rotational basis. So despite the fact that Iceland is not having an army, they still have the support from other NATO members. And here is just security zoomed in even more. So as I said, you can see that Iceland, followed by Canada, and then the United States, puts the most emphasis on security. But still, we are talking about really very little percentage compared to other themes and the topics covered in their both chairmanship programs and policies and strategies. So to sum it up, the whole security sector is relatively fragmented, and as we've analyzed it, all the Arctic states to some extent define security, but none of them really covers all the aspects of the indicator. And some of those other findings you can further find here. I don't want to go really into the details. I mentioned some of them, so you can then also check it later on by yourself. I don't want to eat up the time from our discussion. So I'll skip to the narratives and trends that we've observed when we've analyzed those policies and strategies. And we can see there is an increasing trend of broadening the security sector from purely military perspective and military security understanding, including, for example, human security. So Arctic geopolitics and Arctic security are combined and closely related to the environment. The environment matters the most if you look at those strategies, how they look at the security and how they define it. So security per se is fragmented. And as I said, most quotes by Canada, Iceland, and the United States are the only countries that talks about the comprehensive security. There are also mentioned the border issues, which are actually included only in the Russian strategy, which refers to the delimitation of the territorial waters, the economic zone, and the continental shelf that I've already talked about. NATO and its role is mentioned only by 3 out of 5 Arctic NATO members, and it's again Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. And last point, that the issues connected to maritime security are included in the strategies of 4 states, Canada, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. So these are more or less the highlights of security topics in the Arctic states strategies and policies. And what are the implications for the European or transatlantic security? We know that the Arctic is an important region. There is an increasing interest and importance. There is also this emergence of non-state actors that each of the Arctic states needs to take into consideration and needs to deal with. There is also an increasing number of observer states in the Arctic Council. And as you might know, these are including states that are not connected to the Arctic at all, even though they might define themselves in a way that they are either the near Arctic state or the closest Arctic state and so on and so forth, like China, India, Singapore, Spain, or any other countries that are one of the 13 observers that was there given the observer status to the Arctic Council. And there is also, the rush for natural resources, or often portrayed the one and only interest in non-Arctic states' approaches to the Arctic, but also tourism, part of the political dances or power projection in the region that we might witness when it comes to the engagement of non-state actors, non-Arctic states in the region. There's been also long discussions what will happen in the Arctic and how the Arctic security will develop once the NATO-Russia relations will either deteriorate even more than it's now or improve. So this is something that will definitely have an influence on the dynamics of the security relations in the Arctic. And of course, the security constellations, the global impact, for example, space for military training and testing of nuclear weapons. This is something we also see when it comes to the interest of the both Arctic and non-Arctic states. Another important factor is the rising level of the world oceans and sea. This is something that, of course, is not only the interest of the Arctic states, but is increasingly becoming an interest of the non-Arctic states, because this is something that basically is in the immediate interest of them to, of course, they cannot avoid it, but at least somehow mitigate the consequences of raising the level of the seas, and there's those forecasts that if the old glaciers in Greenland would melt down, it would mean the increase or raising of the seas by 7 meters. So you can think about how, which territories actually in the world, which states would be affected by that. And you will find out that it's really a lot of territories around the world that would need to, relocate and adapt on the situation. And then it leads me to the question whether what prevails, whether it's rather conflict or cooperation. And as you might already guess, my answer is it's rather cooperation. Despite some conflict and potential conflicting areas, the Arctic is the region of cooperation. So as a wrap up, a few points to think about looking towards the future. Of course, the security situation in the Arctic, as I already said, will depend on the security developments in the transatlantic area. And also it will be influenced by the dynamics of this, not only US-Russia relations, but now we see and we call it the US-China-Russia strategic triangle, and how those relations unfold will more or less dictate the terms of peace and stability or conflict and war in the Arctic region. In the near future, we will also see the real challenges related to COVID-19 pandemic. There's been already some studies and research done in this regard. Also, for example, when it comes to the increase of terrorist activities and how terrorists adapt to the new situation and how they use the pandemic for their favor. And many challenges also for the indigenous peoples and local communities throughout the Arctic, and especially challenges from the human security perspective. However, it is always risky as well, difficult to predict the future, but it is safe to say that the current geopolitical reading of the global order and that of the Arctic region points towards a murky, unstable, and conflictual future. Yet, majority of scholars agree that the cooperation in the Arctic prevails and that states will solve the potential disputes by diplomatic means. This is something that I would sign, that this is something that I, throughout my 8 or 9 years researching the Arctic security relations, that this is something that definitely is in the Arctic, that we can define the Arctic as a region of cooperation when the conflicting areas are rather dealt with by diplomatic means. And I think I will stop here, so we can still have. I went a little bit over the time, so I stop here so we can have a bit of the discussion. I'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you for your attention. Here's also the email. If you wish to contact me later on, please feel free to do that. And here's the references for the analysis. And as I said, I will send the presentation to Victoria, so you will have it available also to check it later on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. If everyone could please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause for a really spectacular presentation. Lots of good comments in the chat about the depth and the visualization of your data. And I think, making it so accessible is pretty incredible for a very diverse group of fellows. We have lots of questions. The first one is from Kyung-sa, who wants to know, how do you think about the role of non-Arctic states, for example, in Asia, China, the Republic of Korea, and Japan, in Arctic governance? Do you think that these countries can contribute to the Arctic and its governance, and if so, how?
Sure, thank you very much, Kyung-sari, if I pronounced your name correctly. Very interesting question. Of course, we can sit here for a really long time, just giving the lecture, focusing purely on the involvement of China in the Arctic region. Definitely, there is an increasing role of China and other Asian countries in the Arctic, and you can also witness it not only on the level of the governance, but we both with Victoria are regular attendees of the Arctic Circle conference in Reykjavik, and you can see there that there is really very intensive increase of Chinese and Asians representations, also when it comes to researchers and scientific community. So definitely the interest of the Asian countries in the Arctic is visible, and it's not nothing unusual. Obviously, this is part of when it comes especially to China, the long-term engagement in all of the different regions in the world where they want to be engaged. So I think this is something that definitely is also the question for the Arctic states and how they will be able to respond to the increased interest of the non-Arctic states to the Arctic region. So I think I'll just briefly mention this, and of course we can come back to it later on, or you can pop me a private message later on.
Thank you, and I see the thumbs up there. And I will share both the presentation and email in our follow-up to this. We have another question from Merrick, if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Halaskova, again for your presentation. You already mentioned in your presentation that with NATO activity increasing and great power competition building between US, Russia, and China across the Arctic, maybe it's pessimistic, but I wonder, is a second Cold War era waiting for us?
Thank you for the question. And very briefly, no, I don't think so. And in 1-2 sentences to broaden it, I think that despite, as I said, despite those conflicting areas like the continental shelf or border disputes, or the so-called rush for the natural resources, if you look at the map and how the natural resources are actually spread out across the Arctic, you would see that majority of those resources are within the territories of the respective Arctic states. So there is not really that much space for some big confrontation. So from this perspective, I don't really think we are ahead of the second Cold War So although, of course, never say never, right? Who could predict what would happen in Ukraine in 21st century? So this is something that, of course, I wish I would have a crystal ball to answer that, but based on my academic knowledge so far, I would say no.
Thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
We have another question from Nicholas, 2 questions. One, he is very curious about how the percentages that you shared were determined. So he wanted to know if you could speak a bit to that and where we might access those. And then if you could remark on the current status of outer continental shelf claims in the Arctic, especially Russia's application. And since the US is not party to UNCLOS, what are the legal hurdles to developing its EEZ, exclusive economic zone?
Great questions, both. The first one is very simple, and I will direct you to our analysis. If you click on the link, you will open those 360 pages. And there is actually quite in detail described the whole methodology which is behind our research. We did both, actually, the coding done by computer and also the so-called human coding. So we wanted to avoid any biases, and left out the context. So we really thoroughly analyzed all of the, I think, 55 or 56 documents. And we determined those 12 indicators or areas that we covered. And based on that, basically, we've came up with this very simplified table. There are many other tables and figures in the analysis, so you can check it out by yourself. But this is really, I'm very proud, because this is really one of the most comprehensive analyses done ever on the Arctic states policies and strategy, and the most updated, actually, which is also great. Although some of the Arctic states started to renew their strategies, like Russia, Norway, and Canada, which just did. They just did once our analysis was out. So this is something that was a bit frustrating for us, but at least it leaves some space for us to include it later on and follow up on the analysis what we did. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first, the second question. Okay, it was about the continental shelf and the EEZ. The thing with the United States is that, they didn't ratify it, or they hasn't ratified yet. So it gives them really very little legal rights, how they can pursue with that. So until the UN clause would be ratified, I would guess that there is really not much space for the United States to further take the continental shelf claims or the extension of the continental shelf further.
Thank you. We are trying to get 3 more questions in these last few minutes. Isaac, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. I guess I just had a more personal question. How did you choose to study geopolitics from like an IR political science lens versus a geography lens?
Thank you. Well, it was rather natural, I would say. Previously studying the Arctic region, I was looking at, and my focus, my specialization was on the US/NATO-Russia relations. So this was when actually I started to see that the Arctic started to pop up as a quite important region, and was often portrayed as a sphere, well, depending on what period you are focusing on. So if you read the articles back then from the Cold War, of course, the Arctic pop up as the conflicting region, or the region that was the most heated between the two blocks. But then the most recent scholars, of course, describe the Arctic as being the region potential for cooperation between the US and Russia. So this was something that obviously from my training, the international relations, the geopolitics was rather closer to that. So geography is rather left. I felt more confident to looking at, and I was really passionate and curious how those patterns of cooperation develop, and how the geography really has an impact on the states, what's their position and what's their power. So the Arctic region was just, the ideal example of that. And I stick with that because it's pretty exciting region.
Yeah, I think everyone here would agree, or else we would not be here every Tuesday learning about the Arctic. Pat, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for this presentation. It's really, really impressive. A lot of great work. When you were talking about the implications for European security, you mentioned in your PowerPoint the emergence of non-state actors. Could you talk a little bit more about who these non-state actors are? So either what sectors or what organizational forms you're talking about?
Sure. Thank you, Janine, for a great question. Well, we can, and in Arctic, as in any other region, we can look at those bad guys and good guys. And I'm very happy that actually to see that in the Arctic, it's rather about the good guys, meaning the organizations, the environmental organizations, especially organizations that are supporting the rights of the indigenous peoples and the protection of the environment, that are helping or even making a pressure on the Arctic states to improve, some respective areas of their policies. So these would be the good guys, the NGOs and organizations that support different parts of the societies. Of course, the Arctic is not isolated from the rest of the world. So as I said, we can actually see some increased potential or activities by terrorist organizations, organized crime networks. So these are something that we might also see in the Arctic. However, at this moment, thanks to the pandemic, despite the fact that there is more potential in the future at this moment, since people are not gathering at one places, airports and ports and other places, their activities are rather limited. Although some parts of the critical infrastructure like hospitals might be potential spheres for or areas of their potential attacks. So this is something that we might also consider or take into consideration when also thinking about the long-term negative impacts of the pandemic, not only in the health connotations, but also in the security connotations.
Great, thank you. And we have one final question on the hour. Sasha, do you want to come on and ask yours as the last question?
Sure. Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was concerned and surprised when I saw your graphic that showed that climate change is a relatively small topic in the Arctic Council compared to other issues. That would seem to suggest that these countries are perceiving climate change as less of a threat than other geopolitical threats. Do you agree with that? And do you see the Arctic Council as a space for these countries to put pressure on other countries to reduce emissions, or is that seen as not part of the purpose of the Council?
Well, great question, Sasha. Thank you for that. Honestly, we were also surprised by that. And if you actually open the analysis, you would see that even within the climate change indicator, there's a whole other sub-indicators, or I think 10 more, when we look at even the specifics within the climate change. So we've looked at different other indicators that we've taken into consideration. So you can further see how each of the individual Arctic states or non-Arctic states actually approach the climate change and how we understood it when we've analyzed it. Of course, as I said, thanks to those NGOs and non-state actors, especially environmental organizations, there is increased pressure on the states to do more about the Arctic warming of the Arctic. And you might also heard that recently there's been, so far we always know, or it was known, that the Arctic is warming up by 2%. And just a few weeks ago, or even months, maybe already now, NASA published the analysis that it's already 3%. So it's really dramatic. And sorry, not 3%, 3 degrees. So I'm blaming the jet lag. So the rest of the world, if you look at some of the parts, other parts of the world, it might be 1%, 1.1 or 1.5 degrees Celsius. In the Arctic, it used to be 2 degrees. Now it's 3. So this is really dramatic. And obviously, not only the Arctic states, but other non-Arctic states should be involved in, joining this Arctic states endeavors to further speed up the mitigations policies and adopting those policies, because this is the only way how we can deal with it. We can't change it, we can't stop it, but we can slow it down by those mitigation policies.
Thank you for that uplifting answer, but also for this entire presentation, for being very, very generous with your time, despite being in Costa Rica. We very much appreciate it, and sharing some really incredible research with us. I know you kept saying 300 pages, like that was a deterrent, but I am pretty confident that I will not be the only one digging into that document after your presentation. So if everyone could again join me for a final virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Barbara. I cannot wait to see you again in person in the not too distant future. And hopefully you will see some of our fellows at Arctic Circle or other Arctic gatherings in the years to come. But thank you for sharing so much of your research and your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you, really, guys. It was nice. And thank you for amazing questions. It's always very refreshing, to hear someone. It's like not looking at the black screen. So it's nice to see some faces. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your winter school. It seems really impressive how you set it up, the program, Victoria. So congrats.
Thank you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Costa Rica.
I'll do my best, I promise. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we are now switching from our first hour to our second hour, where I am going to invite our second incredible speaker, Dr. Tracy Curry, to present. She is the owner and principal researcher of Northern Social Environmental Research, which is an Alaska-owned practice dedicated to collaborative place-based research that supports resilience of northern communities by enhancing the agency of local people and their knowledge. She is also an affiliate assistant professor of the International Arctic Research Center and a fellow of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Resilience and Adaptation Program, which means that she is very busy, and we are extremely appreciative of her sharing some of her time today. So I'm going to hand over my virtual mic to you, Tracy, to take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Victoria, and thanks everybody for welcoming me here and allowing me to talk a little bit about my research. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so my name's Tracy Curry, and I live in Fairbanks, Alaska. And as Victoria mentioned, I'm the owner and principal of Northern Social Environmental Research, which is a practice that I established to focus on collaborative and action-oriented research in northern regions. I entered into this field of work generally with an interest in people, landscapes, and climate change. I studied economics and business and public policy for my bachelor's, and I have a master's in landscape architecture, and my PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks is in natural resources and sustainability. So I approach these topics holistically and with a social justice lens. So social and environmental systems are, of course, interconnected, and there are inherent biases in the prevailing governance systems, some of which privilege some groups over others. So part of my work is about identifying and breaking down these barriers. I came to specialize in the North specifically just for the simple fact that I love it here. And with almost a decade of work in the region at this point, this is where I've chosen to settle. So my home is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the Lower Tanana River. And the work I'm going to present today is an extension of research that I did in the native village of Wainwright, Alaska on the North Slope. So the residents of which allowed me to do this work as a contribution to their ongoing efforts in the stewardship of their ancestral homelands. So in my presentation today, learning from the local scale, context-rich images, and the communication of place-based information, I'm going to discuss the challenge of translating local scale information, which is, of course, complex and tied to the unique characteristics of local place. So communicating that to outside audiences, and I'll describe a pilot study in which I take a practical look at some of the conventions for communicating environmental change to public sector decision makers, and test a survey that explores the potential for context-rich visuals and other reporting strategies to effectively convey information about local observations and experience. So this research contributes to the development of communication approaches that are intended to strengthen local agency by increasing the prominence and accessibility of local and indigenous knowledge among information used by decision makers. So this is a quote from one of the participants of the interviews that I did in Wainwright, and it kind of gets to the heart of this topic. So in the context of global climate change, which brings together diverse actors from local communities to international bodies, there's often a mismatch between local priorities and initiatives that often begin at these larger scales. So, and this mismatch is in part perpetuated by persistent biases, such as those that favor Western science and technical information, while at the same time marginalizing other important sources of information like local and indigenous knowledge. So these biases create information blind spots that may adversely impact adaptation outcomes. So, and to explain the role of policy and decision making, I use a framework to explain the role of knowledge in policy and decision making. I use a framework put forth by William Asher et al., where knowledge processes encompass knowledge generation, knowledge transmission, and knowledge use. And so in the knowledge generation component, Asher separates into three general categories. So there's government-driven knowledge, non-government-driven knowledge, and local/indigenous or traditional knowledge. So two of the three of those, government and non-government, are largely information generated from Western science and from a Western worldview. And I'm defining local knowledge here as knowledge generated through observations of the local environment and held by a specific group of people, and then indigenous knowledge as local knowledge held by indigenous peoples or local knowledge unique to a given culture or society. There's lots of different definitions out there. This is the one I've chosen. So these knowledge systems are characterized as context specific and encompassing long timescales of observation. So knowledge transmission, this process begins with all available knowledge and ends with usable environmental knowledge. And so all knowledge goes through a process of screening and framing in which personal and professional biases, along with other limitations, can filter out key information. However, this process reduces the comprehensiveness of knowledge used for decision making, and comprehensiveness is one of the key criteria for evaluating the quality of knowledge. Conventions that marginalize qualitative research and local and indigenous knowledge can result in bounded rationality bias, whereby people are making decisions based on the information that they have, despite having imperfect or insufficient information. And as I mentioned quickly before, it can have negative environmental outcomes and also cause disproportionate harm to underrepresented groups. So this piloted methodology is intended to examine the effect of a reporting approach that combines two components that are generally outside of general conventions in public sector information dissemination. So the first of those being the application of context-rich images to help convey the social and cultural nuances of place-based information. I'll define that in the next slide. And also multiple evidence-based reporting, which engages information from both Western science and local and indigenous knowledge systems. So context-rich images are detailed visuals that address the particularities of specific environments and cultures. And in this way, they can help convey the social and cultural nuances of place-based information. We can consider something like a simple diagram to be an abstracted version of reality where all the details are removed, and it helps us just get to a better understanding of a key concept that we're examining. So the only thing that's left is the information that's necessary to convey the information that's being communicated. Whereas, like in contrast, the most detail-rich image is just a photograph where everything is pictured and remains. So in addition to getting, maybe some information about erosion control measures, we also get information about, weather, time of day, potentially the time of year, housing in the area, et cetera. So maps, diagrams, collages, and a host of other devices can be created to convey rich context, often by embedding them with elements of local culture, including people and the activities that they're engaged in, or highlighting unique environmental character such as temporality or morphology, and also by emphasizing interconnections within the regional social environmental system. So visuals, they excel at ability to express place-based concepts such as social life and lived experience, and often do so more concisely and with greater immediacy than text, which is why they can be helpful in communicating information rapidly or quickly to people who don't have a lot of time. So the second component that I mentioned, the multiple evidence-based or MEB approach, this provides a framework for operationalizing diverse knowledge systems. So it emphasizes, both the separateness and the complementarity of all these different knowledge systems. So rather than, making one fit into the other, we accept each for the benefits that it provides, and then find ways that the information can benefit each other. So an over-reliance on knowledge derived from a single paradigm, whether it be positivist, constructivist, indigenous knowledge, et cetera, may not convey the full range of knowledge necessary for environmental governance efforts. So an MEB assessment is operationalized through the combined presentation of images from diverse knowledge sources. When alternative knowledge sources are presented on equal footing with Western science, it can minimize the possibility that it will be ignored or neglected by decision makers who have personal and organizational biases and information preferences. Like, there are going to be people that are used to looking at numbers and don't have the time of day to read through narrative and that sort of thing. And so how can we make it easier for people to engage with this kind of information? So the goal of the pilot study was developed to assess the benefits and limitations of context-rich images and MEB reporting for conveying place-based information to public sector resource managers and practitioners. So that's the target audience, is public sector resource managers and practitioners. And so these reports integrate, both images and also narrative text. So the whole study it began with a parent study with interviews and including visual representation of major themes from those interviews, and followed up with key informant interviews where I talk to practitioners to get a better understanding of what the current conventions are within their field. And then the pilot study was a 2-phase mixed method study that involved testing a survey and then follow-up interviews with people that did those surveys. So, the parent study began with that initial study in Wainwright, Alaska. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it, but it involved conducting semi-structured interviews with long-term Village of Wainwright residents. The interviews focused on each participant's observations of change throughout their lifetime, as well as family and community scale adaptations in response to unexpected events, environmental changes, economic development, and other factors. So these interviews were transcribed, contextually analyzed, and they yielded really rich information. The most endorsed environmentally influenced challenges causing concern to participants included challenges related to whaling, for example, the timing of migration, the thinning of sea ice, and also seasonal change, timing of seasons, late freeze up, early breakup of oceans and rivers. So I commissioned native artwork from an Inupiaq artist from North Slope, Alaska. His name is George Levitt. He's from Utqiagvik. And so he responded to these themes, to the main themes that came out in these interviews through his own experiences. And so it was important to include native artwork because it provides images from a local perspective and outside of these compositional visual structures of Western culture. And so what I'm showing are some of the examples that Mr. Levitt did on the theme of impacts of declining sea ice on hunting and transportation. Other images were put together by me and derived from photographs. For example, this series of photographs below creates kind of a narrative of the mobility of ice flows and attempts to illustrate the challenge presented to hunters by increasingly distant flows as a result of declining sea ice. And then this montage image below combines the abundant detail of the photograph with the abstracted reality and descriptive function of a diagram. So the photograph shows the visible above ground, and the diagram is an artificial depiction of the invisible subsurface. The photograph, in this case, was chosen to convey scale and magnitude, including the enormous mass of a bowhead whale and the substantial number of people involved in the whaling process. And this photo also serves to emphasize the relationship between people, the whale, and the sea ice. So the key informant interviews, so integrating context-rich images and this MEB assessment into technical reports is in some ways unconventional. And for new approaches to become adopted as standards in practice, it's necessary that they be congruent in some ways with the existing decision tools that people are already using, that are already well accepted. Like we don't want to fight uphill battles for this sort of thing. So I conducted key informant interviews with 5 natural resource management professionals to obtain guidance on target audience selection, study design, and the conventional treatment of qualitative information in their work. So regarding target audience, the guidance from key informants suggested that agency personnel of mid to upper level seniority are the most likely group to encounter mixed quantitative and qualitative information, and people in these positions have broad job responsibilities that necessitate a wide range of information sources, and they also have the authority to make the decisions based on that information. Study design. So the characteristics of the target audience indicate a necessity for brevity and concise information in the study design. So sample reports given to participants should take the form of a policy or issue brief that's 2 to 3 pages in length, and adheres to a report structure that people are familiar with, something with like an introduction, supporting information, and conclusion or key takeaways. Conventional approaches to reporting qualitative info. So qualitative information is typically reported in agency documents using descriptive text and direct quotes from research participants. One key informant had expressed frustration that many of her quantitative-minded colleagues were unwilling to engage information in this format, in this textual format, or to accept it as reliable. So while she assigned a high level of importance to data in the form of written quotes, others perceived it as anecdotal and untrustworthy. Public agency key informants reported that they did not typically see local and indigenous knowledge presented alongside formal science. So these distinct information sources were frequently included in different sections of the same report, but rarely together. So for example, in environmental assessments, which are conducted as part of many environmental review processes, they typically separate like the evaluation of the physical environment, evaluation of the biological environment, and the social and economic environment into 3 distinct sections, but rarely is the information presented together. So insights from these key informant interviews were incorporated into a pilot study design. Participants were asked to complete an online survey, which involved a sequential review of 3 versions of a 2-page report on sea ice variability and its impact on hunting and transportation in coastal North Slope Alaska communities. So this report A, the first one on the left, is the baseline, was designed to follow current norms with text that summarizes knowledge from natural sciences and conventional graphics, including like tables, graphs, charts, and maps. The second one in the middle was report A, but also included quotes from interviews related to the report topics. And then the third version was the same as B, but it also included images. So that was text plus quotes plus images. So participants were recruited. The criteria for participation in the study, they were participants that had expertise in environmental policy, planning, and or decision making, and who had decision making influence within their agency or organization. And they were identified based on recommendations from senior managers at Alaska state and national agencies and organizations involved in environmental management and research. So 8 practitioners from 6 public agencies completed the survey, and 6 participated in a follow-up interview. So again, this is a pilot study and not a full-fledged study yet at this point. So first, ask a series of background questions to gain an understanding of job responsibilities, familiarity with the North Slope of Alaska, experience and perception of local and indigenous knowledge and environmental decision-making, and also learning preferences on a spectrum from highly textual to highly visual. So many of the participants were very familiar. This was 1 out of 1 to 5. Many were very familiar with environmental issues on the North Slope of Alaska. They were less so familiar with social issues. And many they were about average in terms of preference between highly textual and highly visual individuals. Those are just like a few interesting tidbits. So criteria for evaluation: knowledge is more likely to be useful to the extent that it's perceived by decision makers as satisfying criteria for both credibility, which is like scientific validity, and the adequacy of the evidence and the arguments being made, and also salience, the relevance to decision-making needs. So participants were asked to rate the credibility of each sequential report compared to the previous version, and basically neither the addition of quotes or images negatively impacted the credibility of the report overall. Like you might expect people who often work with numbers and graphs and charts to be put off, or to maybe somehow think that a report is less credible because it includes images and pictures, and maybe that's what I expected to find, but people who participated reported that it was always reported that B was no less credible than A, and C was no less credible than B. And then regarding salience, for each context-rich image in report C, participants were asked if the figure helped them to improve their understanding of the information provided in the report. And so this is important because there's no sense in including these additional graphics if they don't provide additional information above and beyond what's already provided in the text. And so we want the addition of these images to not be superfluous, but we want it to be something that contributes additional meaning. So some images were more successful than others. This figure was the most successful, and 57% of respondents said that it very much so improved their understanding. And I'll give you time to read that quote. And figure 2 was the least successful, with 50% of respondents saying that it did not at all. So, and this was interesting. An interesting insight was that the inclusion of paintings was characterized by one participant as distracting because the reader had to engage with the art and make value judgments about the art that were not related to the core message of the report. And they also kind of wondered whether or not there was some like rhetorical purpose of this art trying to like influence or sway their judgment one way or the other. And it also kind of demonstrates the importance of salience for the selection of images, that the image should, like we expect graphs and figures to be precise and precisely match the information that's being shown. And people also expect the same of images. So participants were asked which of the reports A, B, or C do you prefer, given the intended purpose of providing an understanding of current knowledge on key components of sea ice variability on the North Slope of Alaska, as well as understanding of the local context and experience of these changes. So for both of those, to satisfy both of those parts, people overwhelmingly preferred report C with the images, and one preferred B, which is the quotes without the images. And that's a direct quote. So takeaways. Context-rich images, they indicate that there is some benefit in the communication of qualitative information beyond those already provided by textual information, including quotes and narratives. And they likely have useful application both in information reporting techniques and for communicating qualitative research in general. So furthermore, a combined approach, an MEB approach to reporting information from two separate knowledge systems doesn't appear to have any adverse impact on the reception of that information, and it might offer a means to present alternative knowledge sources on equal footing with Western science, thereby minimizing likelihood that decision makers would neglect or ignore it. So, and also, a similar challenge in place-based research systems stems from the difficulty of acquiring images that adequately and precisely communicate place-based research findings, e.g., for example, like the social context within which the results occur. And after data collection activities have already included, it's hard to collect these images after the fact. And there are other methods that would be really useful, actually, if you have this in mind, that you're going to be, that while you're doing your research, if you have in mind the way you intend to disseminate your results, and if that includes images, you might choose to use something like a photo voice or a photo elicitation method, where interview participants themselves would be asked to provide an image for discussion, which would serve the dual purpose of cultivating discussion, but then also providing a relevant, a precise image that then conveys your findings to your audience. And applications to practice. These were just like a few insights from some of the study participants that I found really interesting. And so managers and policymakers are concerned not only with scientific facts, but also with societal relevance, which quotes and images provide. And effective techniques for integrating Western science and local and indigenous knowledge can be useful both for internal and external agency communications. There may be like a local office in Alaska where people are more familiar with these issues, but often they communicate with like the head office in Washington, D.C., where people are a little bit further removed and need a little bit more context and description and a description of research findings. And also for decision makers that are wired toward hard science, this multi-evidence-based approach that presents knowledge from different sources on equal footing can remind them about other important factors to consider. Oops. Sorry, 1 second. I moved this window over my controls, and so I don't know how to find my controls again.
Oh, you're back.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so, yeah, and basically that's it. I have my advisor, this is part of my PhD research, and my advisor and we have a paper that's been published in Frontiers in Communication, and there's a lot more detail on a lot of the topics I discussed today. And if anyone has any questions, you can also feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to chat and discuss. And with that, I'll just leave it open for questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tracy. If everyone could give a huge virtual round of applause for an incredibly in-depth view of not just research, but meaningful research, and an incredible amount of takeaways for the researchers on this call. I hope that everyone was taking really intense notes during this, because I know I was. We have many questions that have come in the chat. I'll ask Nicholas if you want to come on and ask your question first.
Sure. Hi, Tracy. How are you?
Hey, Nick. Hi, Nicholas.
So that was really awesome, and I definitely familiarized myself with a bit of your work back a month ago. But I wanted to ask, I guess there seems to be a political tension between kind of indigenous knowledge versus traditional ecological knowledge, and which ones are considered perhaps more all-encompassing or less kind of circumscribed by specific uses and specific applications. So I was wondering if you encountered that in terms of the use of those two terms of IK versus TK, and like how they were being deployed by the community and by potential policymakers. And also, yeah, is there a kind of extractive quality to ecological knowledge where more holistic observations by community members get kind of sidelined and not treated as relevant information, despite the kind of the holistic nature of indigenous knowledge as it's understood?
Yeah, so I think in deciding between, so I know there are some people that have very strong opinions about what the proper word is, whether it be indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. And I know that many would say like traditional knowledge maybe would make some people assume that this is knowledge that's not changing, when in fact it is always evolving and learning as time goes. And maybe others may not prescribe that, but I think that just because it did seem a little bit more all-encompassing, I chose to use indigenous knowledge. But also you'll notice that I frequently also said local knowledge, because not all local knowledge is indigenous knowledge. And whether one actually is more comprehensive than the other, or I think that they all have something important to contribute to research, and which is also kind of goes along with that multiple evidence-based approach, that we accept knowledge on its own terms and absorb with and and what's the word I'm thinking of? Absorb and amalgamate and add to, I guess, with rather than trying to integrate things from different places, much rather, take what we can learn from each thing on its own terms, if that makes sense. And then the second part of the question, can you remind me what it was again?
I mean, it's really, I think it's in keeping with your answers right now. It's just another way of kind of phrasing it, which is, like the ecological components, like observations about animal populations, et cetera. Like that seems to be what oftentimes gets foregrounded, as opposed to, discussions of values, social and cultural values and things of that nature that are equally as important to convey to policymakers.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned that ecological research being extractive. I think that all research has the potential to be extractive if it's not also focusing on what it can give back to people and how people might benefit from this research. Because many would say like knowledge just for the sake of knowledge is useful in itself, but you're asking people to dedicate their time and their resources to give you information. And so if your research can be beneficial for their priorities and concerns, then that is optimal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask Madison, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Thank you so much, Tracy, for your presentation. I really hope that I can learn from your presentation and implement it in my own work. I was just wondering, I thought what you said about the artwork being the least effective was very interesting, especially as art's been used for so long to convey messages and context. Do you think that there could be a difference between how effective artwork is if you viewed it in real life compared to images of artwork in reports? Do you think that would change things? Would it be more effective if they could physically see it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that raises a really good point, because like the artwork, being photographed and put onto the pages of a 2-page report, it's being removed from its intended context, which would be like on a gallery wall. And so like maybe the audience didn't have an opportunity to engage with it in a way that it should have been engaged with. But then that said, like we don't always have the opportunity to bring, in decision makers to a art gallery to show them art and works and things like that. And so it's kind of like a practical question about, how do you get the biggest bang for your buck in a 2 to 3 page short report? And maybe there's some artworks that maybe can fulfill that, but there's just this particular one that was created for this research may not have been the right image for it.
Thank you. Todd, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Sure. Thank you for the great presentation. I learned a ton, so I really appreciate it. And my mind's going a million different directions. So hopefully I can read some of your material later and think more about it. But I just had a quick question. So I work in the field of design anthropology. So we look at sort of how designers produce things in collaboration with communities. And I'm also very much invested in education. So I think about activities and how we bring people together. And listening to this presentation, I was excited by the way in which you were engaging sort of with imagery and sort of co-production of sort of knowledge through sort of image making. And I was wondering, given that, with COVID, so much has moved online, a lot of the participatory workshops and webinars that we do are all sort of facilitated through Zoom. I was interested in sort of how you might use these sort of techniques within that space. So are there particular framing activities or ways in which you sort of ask people to sort of engage with these materials within these online virtual spaces that help mediate sort of this process in ways that are maybe slightly different than in non-virtual worlds? So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't have anything to do with what you're saying, feel free to ignore me. So thank you again, though.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying, and it's a great question. and I think I haven't had the opportunity too extensively to engage in the remote communication world using these methods, but my sense is that there would be more opportunity because, again, like another limitation was kind of like what can you fit on a page that can be printed and legible. And when you're reading something that's a hard copy versus reading something that's on your screen, like if it's on your screen, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and you can potentially fit more information and be a little bit and have just a lot more flexibility than you could be, using print media and things that are just kind of in person. So I would think that you would just have, more opportunity to explore more things.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have a few more questions. So we have a question from Harmony, who asks, do you think that the future of research in the North is also working with photographers? Or how have you facilitated image gathering from the local communities?
Yeah, I think it would, if you have the budget, it would be really great to hire a photographer to be able to take pictures for you, because then that frees you to focus on other activities while someone else is taking pictures. And I know in a lot of my free time when I was in Wainwright, I would just walk around and take pictures and that sort of thing. I think that, like I mentioned, that photo voice and photo elicitation methods, I have a little bit of experience doing that, but not for this research in particular. But those are like really well used. Those are very, very much used methods in which you might give people cameras and ask them to take pictures of things that are influencing them, in which case the images that you get would be beneficial both for the discussion and the interviews or focus groups, but also for the reporting of your research findings.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question and a appreciation statement for someone who's a visual learner and communicator to thank you for your work. And the question is, what are your thoughts on systems thinking as a nonlinear bridging of evidence types?
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit, like very briefly about that in the beginning. Like we have social systems, we have environmental systems, and everything is interconnected. And it kind of speaks to this, if you have an environmental report, in some ways it makes sense to separate, the ecology, the biology chapter from the economics chapter, from like the physical sciences, like, or physics and whatever other chapters, but there should also be like a synthesis chapter that kind of takes a stab at how these different things influence one another and how they're interrelated. And I don't think that we do enough of that synthesizing work.
Yeah, and maybe if I could ask a follow-up of my own question of, have you seen, pathways to do more of that type of work? Is there more of that synthesis work rather than delineation between individual chapters, disciplines? Do you see more of that, or where's research kind of going in this?
I'm not aware that there is a broad field of research that looks specifically at, public sector environmental reports and tells you like the best way to do things. And as I mentioned, like this is a pilot study, and I haven't taken the next step to go ahead and do a full-fledged study, just because I think it's one of those things that is actually like pretty easy to facilitate. Like if you're a public agency and you have a communications department, like why not try to put out a report that, that includes images and text. And if there's anyone on the call that has ideas about doing that, I'd be happy to chat with you, and I'd be happy to, survey your audience members afterwards to, see what the impact of those images were.
Yeah, I will make sure to share your email if anyone on the call would like to follow up. There's always a lot of excitement after the sessions, so I'm sure people are already thinking about follow-up questions or comments. We have another question, Henry. I'm not sure if you want to come on and ask, or I will read it for you. I didn't ask you if you wanted to come on because it just came in.
I can just ask. I guess I was just, you mentioned how important you found that the images that you used, how they precisely matched the findings that you wanted to communicate. And I guess I was wondering, in relation to artwork, do you think one of the reasons why it wasn't as successful in what you found at communicating was that it couldn't connect in as precisely of a way? And then I thought I would ask what your perspective was regarding the use of commissioned versus perhaps already existing artwork in communicating some findings in the future.
Yeah, so I think maybe a challenge in this research was that there was a timing issue, and that like the artwork was commissioned before the report was put together, but then also it was, I didn't want to tell the artist exactly the image that I wanted to have, you know, because there was this thing about having you know, visuals that were outside of this Western convention of representation. And so by me telling the artist that I want you to show exactly this, maybe I would have gotten exactly what I wanted, but maybe I would have missed out on something in particular. But that said, maybe that's not the approach to take if you're going to be putting together images specifically for a report to convey information. Maybe it makes sense to commission artwork from someone and say exactly what you want the image to show. Did that answer all of your question? Was there another part?
No, that answered it. I mean, I can see the value in, I mean, obviously you don't want to, part of creating artwork is obviously telling your own story and telling your own interpretation. So I can understand how walking that line between trying to convey or trying to have it best fit your message and also giving the artist obviously the freedom to convey their own experience. I can see that being a fine line to walk.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think if no one has any final questions, I did a final call, but I wasn't seeing any others coming in. I am going to again invite everyone to give a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing an hour of your time with us, your research, your expertise, your ideas, and a lot to think about that I'm sure will generate lots of follow-up discussions amongst our fellows. I see Pat already nodding her head, so I'm confident there will be lots of follow-up. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And